So, last time I was talking to you about the prehistory of the Cold War, about some ideas about the balance of power, realistic conception, so to speak, about the Cold War, about the balance of power, realism, and some other historical questions, geopolitics, some ways of looking at the background to the Cold War. And I was also talking about revolutionary traditions and different ways we can visualize the historical events that we're going to describe in a broader way. And I was speaking from an outline with the title Reflections on the History of World Politics Before the Cold War. So that's the outline I used last time. And this time I want to give a discussion, or I want to talk about the Cold War and the Chinese Revolution, the first 5 years of the Cold War, the period roughly from 1945 to 1950. I hope you're reading along in Think, and I hope you are noting the difference between things that Fink says and things that I say. I mean, it isn't an ocean of difference, and there's a great deal of agreement, of course, but it is a slightly different perspective. I think you could probably say the same thing for all the materials that we're using for this course, including the films, that you have very different perspectives, and those are the kinds of things that we want to use as a point of departure for our discussions as they move through the semester. So I also hope you'll be taking note of Oliver Stone's version of some of the things that we were talking about last time, and some of the things that we'll talk about this time, because there's a difference between Stone and myself. There's a difference between Fink and myself, and those are the things that will serve as a kind of a prompt for your own particular takes. And I'm expecting you, of course, you know, it's a college course, I'm expecting you all to have your own particular take on these events, to be, you know, searching for, how to put it, searching for truth in your own individual and authentic way. You know, that's what a college course is designed to accomplish. So those are the things we talked about last time, and today let's talk about the Cold War and the Chinese Revolution, or the general theme about this thing, how the Cold War developed in the European theater, and seemingly most sharply in the European theater. And as far as the United States was concerned, you know, thinking about it during the days when the Cold War did develop, a conflict that they thought was pretty much exclusively limited to the European theater. And then as soon as that happens, only to find out that there's an Asian theater of the Cold War as well. And I want to look at that in terms of Russia's agency in this, especially Stalin's agency as a revolutionary in transferring the Cold War from a European conflict into an Asian conflict during this period, under the pressure, of course, of having the Cold War imposed upon him. So you'll note that there's a difference of interpretation here that we're suggesting. Last time we were talking about some of the different viewpoints about this thing, general historical perspectives on the matter. I said that, you know, the first historians of the Cold War, who operated between 1945 and, I would say about 1960 or 1965, those people gave a pretty old-fashioned view of the matter, which was very quickly discarded in the 1960s by my generation of historians who came to the fore. And the old view was that the U.S. got completely surprised by Soviet Russia, that Russian aggression starts the Cold War, and it comes out of the blue. From the United States, from the perspective of the United States, comes completely out of the blue, and the United States scurries to cobble together a response, and that's how the Cold War begins, with Russian aggression. And then the second view, the 60s view, the view of most of the historians who came forward in my time, the students of William Appleman Williams at the University of Wisconsin, and a lot of other famous names who wrote a lot of books on this topic, some of the people whom I knew. Their view is that the Soviet Union is not the real actor in any of this, and that the Cold War was pretty much forced on the Soviet Union. The old view was all wet, and the Cold War is pretty much forced on the Soviet Union against its will because of the residual anti-communism, the hostility between the Russian Revolution and the capitalist West that has existed nonstop in their view from 1917. And then there's my view, the third view that I offered last time, that this second view, this view that the Cold War dates from 1917 and has always existed, etc., that's not quite right. That if that really were the case, that there had been a line of continuity between the Russian Revolution in 1917 right up to the Cold War, if that had really been the case, we in the United States, as a capitalist country, we would have been siding with the fascist powers. I mean, after all, they're the best Cold Warriors, are they not? That was the whole con that Hitler tried to foist upon the ruling orders, not only of his own country, but also of every other European country and every country in the world, to appeal to these capitalist rulers that he was the only one who could save us from communism. So he is the great, great anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik, the solution to the Russian Revolution, blah, blah, blah. So the whole, how to put it, the whole confidence game of fascism revolved around its anti-communism, and I guess you have to call that its Cold War perspective. I mean, we wouldn't have used that word then, but it's anti-communist. At any rate, it's anti-communist perspective. But the United States did not side with the anti-communists, with Hitler, Mussolini, the Mikado, and all the others. It did not side with those people, but it ended up siding with the Soviet Union. What did I say? Not just the United States, but Churchill's Britain and de Gaulle's France, and you know, we all ended up siding with the communists. So this is not such a simple story, and the role of the United States is not so simple. The older view, right, that is to say, the view of my contemporaries, 60s people, the United States consistently a reactionary force, I guess you have to say, in world politics. And I'm kind of arguing against that. It's a little more complex than that. The United States sometimes a wholesome force, and often during the period we're discussing, certainly, and during the period we took up last time, the most wholesome force in the world, as wholesome as they get in the world, as progressive, so to speak, as they get in the world. Along with all the other things that we have to take into consideration, of which we are reminded, of course, by Oliver Stone. So a little bit more complex, tangled, perhaps you have to say dualistic kind of conception was the one that I think I put forward last time. So you have at least 3 conceptions from the discussion of last time. So today let's talk about the Cold War itself and the Chinese Revolution, how all that developed. We have to start with the discussion of World War II and its great spiritual victory over the fascist powers, the enormous elation that we see in the world as a result of this colossal victory over the fascist powers. Well, let's see. And a great elation among all the peoples of Europe, all Republicans and Democrats, right-wingers, left-wingers, all the rest of that at the enormous victory over fascism. And what it means internationally, and here's a cartoon that illustrates the Rooseveltian conception of the people who are going to run the world after World War II. They're going to be the Big Four policemen. So the Big Four policemen of France, you notice, is absent from this muster. It's going to be the Soviet Union, United States, Britain, and China. Chiang Kai-shek's China, Kuomintang China. It's going to be a great power, one of the 4 policemen in the world, and really going to have a sphere of influence, you have to put it, a sphere of influence in Asia. After all, it's Chinese troops who are in Vietnam at the end of the war, and they're Kuomintang troops, and Ho Chi Minh, for the Chinese communists, would like to see them thrown out. But it's the will of the United States, and Ho Chi Minh wants to go along with the United States in 1945. So that's the perspective that the Roosevelt administration at any rate starts out with. That's not going to be the way it's going to turn out. But this is the one that President Roosevelt had in mind if he had only lived. And we see this kind of broad political alliance between what you might call communists, liberals, people of every political stripe, people from every country. These four women who are dressed in appropriate colors of the Allies here. They don't represent Communist China, but they have France in here as one of the four. These are not the four policemen, but these are four of the powers associated with the thing. And there's of course, a Soviet representative. I don't know if she's actually a communist or not, but there's the symbolism of the thing, that everybody's been fighting together, pulling an oar to destroy fascism. And the Soviets, of course, they present this to their public as a great, great victory of the Russian Revolution. As a post-Soviet text that is used to teach high school historians puts it, and a contemporary text of today. As this text puts it, the Soviet Union and the idea of communism faced a terrible, terrible challenge in the course of World War II, but it passed the test. So the victory in World War II is a vindication of the Russian Revolution and all of its great travails to develop Russia. And of course the Russian people, of course, exulting in almost exactly the same way. With this idea that we're all going to be pulling together in the future and we're all going to march toward progress. We're going to have a much more liberated and progressive and leftist, I guess you have to say, a leftist point of view about the reconstruction of a new order. We're not going to, have communism all over the world. We'll have some kind of a compromise between communism and the American New Deal and every other kind of leftist movement, including British Labour and all the rest of that. And as you know, when you talk about the left, you're not just talking about communism, but you're talking about many, many different strands of opinion. And the mood is definitely, I say, the popular mood is that these will all see eye to eye now that they've combined together, despite their differences, to defeat fascism. So there's a great sense of elation and, how to put it, expectation, hopeful expectation about the future that attaches to this point of view. So I think of it that way, and I also want to see it in terms of the opinions of the Soviet leadership, and especially of Stalin himself. Terrible despot. We'll talk more about that as we proceed, but let's not talk so much about it just now. Terrible despot at home, but a great hero abroad as the great victor over the fascists. What is his policy for the post-war period? Now, I would say it is not a policy for the Cold War. Start out there. Now, here we differ with a number of others, and perhaps I differ with a number of you on that. I'll be interested to see how you criticize me about that, how you approach that question. But I would argue that Stalin is not at all oriented toward conflict of any sort with the United States. Stalin wants to be as friendly with the United States as is possible. The one who does his thinking for this, in my opinion, between 1944 and 1947, that is before the Cold War has fully set in, a pre-Cold War perspective, that is, the one who does the thinking of this is E.S. Varga, Yevgeny Samoilovich Varga. So he is really a Hungarian. He was with Béla Kun's Hungarian dictatorship in 1919 in Hungary. He's been associated with the communist regime. He's been in Moscow as an exile ever since. He's probably their most sophisticated economist. Wrote in the 1920s about not about Nazi Germany, about Weimar Germany, and how the Soviets should side with Weimar Germany and see it as a kind of colonial country revolting against Western imperialism. Very interesting notions about what might be called national Bolshevism and the importance of German nationalism in the Soviet's revolutionary world anti-imperialist perspective. So he's a very sophisticated economist, and in my opinion, he is the voice. His articles can be read during this period in his journal, International Affairs and World Politics, it's called. Excuse me, International World Economy and International Relations is the title of the journal, scholarly journal that he edits. Not translated. Stuff is not translated. So he writes in Russian for Russian readers. And his articles during this period pretty much give us the key, in my opinion, the key to understanding Soviet foreign policy, Stalin's foreign policy in the years 1944 and 1947. So what does Varga argue? He says that the discussions between Roosevelt and Churchill at Yalta in 1945, in which the United States seems to see eye to eye with the Soviet Union, rather more than it sees eye to eye with Britain, those discussions seem to indicate that there's going to be a very considerable friendship between the Soviet Union and the United States after the war. Moreover, that in terms of Marxist analysis of the capitalist world, that the antagonism between Great Britain and the United States is the primary antagonism in world politics. Soviets have been saying this for a long time. Back in the 20s, they made the very same argument. And it sort of makes sense in a sort of rudimentary way that Great Britain and the United States, with their big navies, are going to be the big naval rivals, and that everybody else is going to be secondary. That seems to be indicated by the discussions at the time of the Washington Naval Conference of 1922, etc. But that never panned out. That antagonism between Britain and the United States, that naval antagonism, it's always there, and we'll see it in this course, in fact. Not exactly a naval antagonism, but we'll see plenty of differences of opinion between the United States and Britain. But it never pans out as the primary antagonism in world politics, as the Soviets would have liked to see it. Anyhow, Varga starts there, that Britain and the Americans are going to be quarreling. The Americans are anti-colonial. The British want to hang on to their colonies no matter what. That's the primary antagonism. Soviet Union sees eye to eye with the United States. Soviet Union is willing to cooperate with the United States in any of its endeavors to promote a post-colonial world, decolonization, the fundamental spiritual, spiritual bridge between the United States and Soviet Union vis-a-vis Britain. And with Britain, you have to also say France, insofar as it's a colonial power, and also Holland, Portugal, places like that, who still have colonies. But the essential thing is colonies. Then about the settlement in Europe at the end of the war, he says all these countries that the Red Army has liberated, indicated on the right side of the screen in pink here. So it's Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Bulgaria, etc. So all these East Central European satellite regimes, they will soon be called, not called right away, they are not to be driven into a regime that copies the Soviet experience. That's to say, the Soviet Union is not to impose the dictatorship of the proletariat on these new states. No. Soviet Union is to impose a kind of a reform, kind of intermediate regime that will have many features of Western democracy, presumably, including a multi-party democracy, hopefully. And to that end, the Soviets have to revive some of the pre-war non-communist parties that were crushed by the fascists when they dominated these countries. So here we have to look back on the history of East Central Europe and generalize a little bit. And the Cold War cliche, the conventional wisdom on this was that, oh, these were just poor independent countries seeking their own freedom, and presumably they had systems and institutions pretty much like the West. No. The East European regimes were of a very different character during the period before World War II. There were Western democracies. Germany and Italy became fascist countries, but France hung on to its democracy. Spain became fascist. Poland became pretty close to a fascist regime under Piłsudski and Colonel Beck. after they made a coup d'etat in 1926. Hungary was pretty much of a fascist regime under Admiral Horthy. Romania and Bulgaria, I think you have to pretty much say the same thing. King Boris in Bulgaria, great admirer of Hitler. So they are mainly fascist regimes in East Central Europe. These regimes really, since it's such an agricultural, I should say, it's such a relatively less industrialized region than West Europe, it's no accident that they're mostly peasant populations, and that the peasant parties, when you have elections in regimes like this, and some of them did have intermediate elections before they were clamped down on, some even continue to have these elections under the dictatorships, peasant parties are important. Of course, the peasant party gets power in one of these regimes that they did in Bulgaria in 1923, or in Poland prior to 1926, that's likely to produce an army coup, a coup from the right. Think of Latin American politics, and you get a little better idea about East Central Europe. Agrarian regimes, they produce populist democracies. They go too far to the left, the army steps in. There's always this problem of authoritarianism on the right as against this kind of Bryan-esque sort of democracy on the left. That's the pattern in East Central Europe. So the fascist powers crushed these peasant parties, and so did the Nazis when they overran this area with their troops during the war. After the war, the Soviets revive all of these peasant parties, and indeed set things up so that elections can elect them. Try to make a bloc with them. Now, our way of looking at it is the Soviets denied elections in East Central Europe. We like to think of it that way. Well, okay, maybe they're not elections that look exactly like the ones we would have liked, but they're elections that look like the ones that the Soviets, Stalin, would have liked. And their trick was to say, we'll have free elections. It's just that we'll set up the coalitions in such a way that we'll pick a party and we'll make that into the government party, the most authoritative party. Won't be the Communist Party. Communists will stand aside from this. But we'll pick that party and we'll try to give it the best support, and no doubt people will vote for it. I mean, they won't be voting for communism, presumably. They'll be voting for a compromise or a pro-communist party, a peasant party, a party that has genuine support from the bulk of the population. So they put these peasant parties in power in coalition with communist parties, which in almost every case they sit in those parties as minorities. So that's the scheme. It's called people's democracy, as Varga coined that term. A people's democracy in East Central Europe. And Varga imagines that something similar is going on in the areas where the West where the United States has the most influence in Western Europe. True enough, in France and Italy, the resistance, pretty much led by the communists, a lot of Catholic priests got involved in it too, but mostly led by the communists in France and Italy, and they're going to be a powerful party. Both those countries break down, if I can generalize about it, both those countries break down in their politics pretty roughly 1/3 each between communist parties, socialist parties, and a new regime on the right, a bourgeois party which calls itself a Christian democracy in a Catholic country, and which looks to the support of the papacy. So that's the party of the right. So you got a right-wing party, a socialist party, and a communist party. Now, strictly speaking, if the communists and socialists got together, they could run these regimes. And you would have a sort of leftist regime there. But the perspective for the communists under Varga's line, under Stalin's line, is to combine with everybody. National coalitions, tripartite regimes. So they combine with the Christian democracy. The communists in France support de Gaulle. They combine with the Christian democracy. So you have these tripartite regimes in the West, and you have all-party coalitions in the East. So Varga imagines that the West, we can show the West that we're not trying to cause too much trouble by joining in general patriotic regimes that include all the parties in the West by telling the communists to lay off too much left-wing activity. And more than that, if Trotskyists, anarchists, and other leftists should make strikes, communists will break these strikes, will fight against these people. Communism becomes a party of order under this rubric, under this way of politicking. And that is the line of the Soviets at the end of the war. And they're going to support de Gaulle. And they're going to suppress the left wing. And bear in mind, in France and Italy, and even in Britain, I think the population generally is much to the left of all of these people. And ready to make strikes, ready to change the world. I don't know if they're revolutionary, but they want a lot of big changes. That figures after a war, when the veterans come back. They're very militant and hard to please. So anyhow, Varga's notion is there'll be a balance between tripartism in the West and all-party coalitions in the East. We'll try to slow things down in the East as much as possible so as to continue to earn the goodwill of the United States. And the United States hopefully will appreciate that we're not encouraging the French and Italian communists to lead their resistance veterans to power, which they could probably easily do. That is the line of the Soviet Union. That's the line of the people's democracy, so-called. Okay, now there's one important part to this that doesn't seem to line up in quite the nice way that Varga has it imagined, and that's Yugoslavia. Because Yugoslavia is a revolutionary regime, and it's led by communists. They're partisans in the war. They've defeated the Nazis pretty much on their own. Excuse me, still talking about Yugoslavia. And they've defeated the communists. I mean, they defeated the Nazis pretty much on their own, have not required the Red Army to liberate them. They're going to be part of this communist bloc at the end of the war. And Varga says they are the best example of the people's democracy. And their efforts to aid the Greek communists were in an analogous situation. They're leaders of the anti-fascist resistance, for the most part, and they think they've got an excellent opportunity, great popularity in the country, to take power at the end of the war and have a revolutionary kind of regime in Greece, kind of comparable to the revolutionary regime in Yugoslavia. So the Yugoslavs are doing everything they can to help out the Greek communists. That's going to cause a lot of trouble. Let me get to that in just a second, and after I've described some other elements of the settlement at the end of the war. So perhaps you know all this well, but let me just go through it very quickly. Germany to be divided into 4 zones. At first no French zone, but after a few days after the VE Day, the French were given a zone in the Rhineland, the Saar, and the Black Forest area, indicated in orange on this map. The United States has all the nice part of Germany, this good ski country in the south with all these lovely places to visit, ski resorts and all that. The British have control of the north part, the more industrially interesting and active part of, and then the Soviets have the eastern area, Prussia, West Prussia, I guess you have to call it, West Prussia, and the area around Berlin. Berlin itself to be divided into 4 zones. Now Vienna, not shown here on this map, but also to be divided into 4 zones, as you see in the great movie of Carol Reed, The Third Man, about the 4-power occupation of Vienna. Fantastic film. See it before you die, is my advice about that. And some other elements of the settlement that are of interest to us, what they did with Poland. So all this is agreed very much between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, mainly between Churchill and Stalin. In fact, Churchill tells in his account of the war how with 3 matches they changed the boundaries of Poland. So prior to the war, Poland has these 2 sections on the right, the one that's striped and the one that's gray, and afterward it is moved west and it takes over the area, the striped area and gray striped area to the west. So look at it on a different map. This gives an indication of pre-war Poland. The red area above is pre-war Poland. It includes a lot of non-Polish territory. That's mostly the territory that went over to the Soviet Union. That's got Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians for the most part, maybe 9 million people or so. Poland only had about 27 million prior to the war, so that's a considerable minority. And a lot of Jewish people in that part of Poland prior to the war. They were not treated well. I mean, I don't know if Poland was as anti-Semitic as Germany, but it was a, I don't know, tight race, a photo finish, strictly speaking, in the pre-war period. It was not a pleasant regime from the standpoint of the minorities prior to the war. Anyhow, the Poles are going to lose those minorities. They were all part of the Russian Empire in the first place. The Poles seized them by force in 1920 in the war between Poland and Russia. So these territories in the east are going to go to the Soviets, and in compensation, it's mostly agrarian territory in the east. In compensation, the Poles will get all this lovely German industrial area in the west, which includes all sorts of big industrial towns like Breslau, which will be renamed Wrocław. They get Polish names to all these places. Stettin, the port, thriving working port, to be called Szczecin, to be given a Polish name. So they drove about 5 million Germans out of this territory, did the Poles. And these Germans, ethnically cleansed, so to speak, they're going to end up in West Germany. They're going to be very, very irredentist, very much seekers of revenge. And they're going to be very anti-Soviet. At least that whole generation probably passed from the scene by now. But that old generation will be very, very anti-Soviet in West Germany. So Churchill tells how with 3 matches, he and Stalin simply moved the borders of Poland westward in the way that you see here. And that's the Poland, Poland in red at the bottom. That's the Poland that we're dealing with today. And I must say, despite the very, very high-handed way, all of this, to say the least, that this was accomplished, I have to say that this Poland is probably better integrated ethnically than any Polish state has ever been. So I mean, there's all Poles in this Poland. The other Polands, all of the other Polands that have existed, well, really only one, unless you go back to the 17th century. But they have been regimes in which Poland was only one state among many. So here we have a Poland for the Poles, for the most very, very nationally, linguistically integrated Poland. So those are 2 things we'll have to bear in mind. We'll refer to them again in different contexts about different problems as they emerge. But what were we talking about? Oh, France figures in this as well. De Gaulle now is going to be put in power mainly by Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, the main thing that Eisenhower was afraid of was that the left would rise up. There'd be a lot of strikes, and you'd get a really revolutionary maybe a Soviet regime in France at the end of the war. Remember, post-war, it's always a radical situation. The soldiers return home eager to bring in a new regime. And bear in mind also that the wartime tyranny has been overthrown, and so you shouldn't be surprised that France is very revolutionary. In 1945, there are going to be big strikes and all the rest of that, and everybody will be wondering what the socialists and communists, whether they want to lead all of this movement. But anyhow, Eisenhower was afraid about all of this and thought if he instilled de Gaulle in power, that this all could be headed off, and there wouldn't be a revolution in France, and that would be, to Eisenhower's point of view, to Eisenhower's way of thinking, that would probably be the best thing for U.S. interests in this matter. Roosevelt did not like de Gaulle and did not like setting him up in power, and only conceded to this very, very reluctantly. Why didn't he like de Gaulle? I think he did not want to establish French imperialism at the end of the war. He did not want to come to the aid with U.S. troops of the French in Indochina to reestablish a colony there. I think that's a big, big thing. And moreover, it was not even particularly sympathetic to any of the colonial pretensions of the French regime, which would have to be reasserted now at the end of the war. Remember, France had been defeated, and so it's going to try and reestablish itself as a big colonial power. It's got to do it with force. And Roosevelt was against any of this. Also, he thought de Gaulle was a man of the leagues, of the right-wing veterans leagues and semi-fascist movements of the 20s. That's not really fair to de Gaulle. He's never a fascist. But he is a kind of a right-winger and a conservative and a military man, a potential Bonaparte. You could say all these things about de Gaulle. He turned out to be a lot different from that, but that was the expectation in 1945. So, what Roosevelt had in mind there was essentially a fear of the U.S. involvement in reestablishing French power in the world, I think. Not just in Europe, but in the world. Churchill's viewpoint, just the opposite. He says he wants a strong France. He's willing to fight to reestablish the French in Indochina, for example, and in all their colonies, except Syria. He's going to campaign against the French in Syria and going to side with the Arab League. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So de Gaulle brought to power, friend of Eisenhower, as we already indicated, but also a very close friend of the Soviets. And 1944, no sooner did he take over France than he went to Moscow and had a nice heart-to-heart with Stalin about the comity, the amity, the community of fate that the French and the Germans enjoyed. And de Gaulle could really pour on this verbiage when he talked about continental nations like France and Russia, who had things in common, as opposed to maritime nations like England and the United States. And he liked to refer to England and the United States collectively as the Anglo-Saxons. So we French have much more in common with a continental nation that depends on agriculture, as we do, than do the worldly maritime Anglo-Saxons. And we're going to get a Europe that's to our liking, meaning Germany is going to be suppressed. Germany is not going to be permitted to revive. That's really the heart of the matter for realists, and those of you who are attracted by the geopolitical way of looking at things. That really is the heart of the matter between Churchill and de Gaulle, is to keep Germany down. And at the end of their visit, as indicated by a partridge of Punch, who we followed in my other course on the 20s and the 30s, we followed his cartoons. Those two fellows are very friendly. France and Russia are going to be on very good terms from this point on. They're going to be certainly agreed about Germany, that Germany is not to be permitted to revive. Okay, so let's go back to Yugoslavia for just a second. We're talking about the uniqueness of Yugoslavia, its revolutionary quality, its independence from the Soviets, and its activities in support of a Greek revolution. They're led by Josip Broz Tito. So he is a charismatic figure, great leader, great speaker, tremendous politician, tremendous revolutionary leader. I mean, really second to none. He considers himself more of a revolutionary even than Stalin, of all things. And he's proved it, arms in hand, fighting against the Nazis in Yugoslavia. Long-time supporter of Stalin, faithful communist from the 30s, revered in Yugoslavia and many other places in Eastern Europe as a revolutionary almost on the scale of Stalin. So that is really saying something for communists to make such a statement. Here's a picture of him from a little bit later, and we'll be talking more about this shortly, during the middle 50s, when he is conferring with the leaders of the Third World. Here we have him conferring with Ho Chi Minh of South Vietnam, and discussing questions of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism. So he's going to consider himself a revolutionary ally of all of the fighting revolutionary nationalist forces in the world fighting against European imperialism. And we'll have a lot to say about Tito and how he figures in all of this, and how the Soviets are going to have to try to deal with this. This is a very interesting thing for us, which normally doesn't get the attention that it really deserves. Moreover, Churchill himself supported Tito. So Churchill had a choice. There's another leader there, the leader of the Chetnik forces, Mihailovich, that Churchill could have supported, certainly would have been spiritually in tune with as a man of the right. But Churchill did not support Mihailovich because Mihailovich and his Chetniks didn't do much fighting against the Nazis, didn't do a good job fighting against the Nazis, did rather better against the communists. And Tito really turned in a good day's work for his pay as a revolutionary and as a ally in the war. And Tito's partisans, of course, earned the respect, probably for military reasons, from Churchill. Churchill also, though, had to come to terms with Stalin over all of these problems that we've been discussing. In particular, who's going to run East Central Europe. And here's a little document of great interest to us as historians, the famous Percentages Agreement of October 1944, in which Churchill and Stalin sit down between them, to hell with Roosevelt. Roosevelt not even consulted with any of this. They sit down between them and decide who's going to run East Central Europe. And there they are. There are the percentages. Churchill says to Stalin, the Russians can have 90% of Romania, 75% of the influence in Bulgaria, provided that we British have 90% of the influence in Greece, and you communists, you Russians, you only have 10%. So basically, the British have been assured by Stalin that they can have Greece. They can control Greece at the end of the war. The communists won't bother them there. Tito is already helping the Greek partisans to establish a revolutionary regime in Greece. So you see what's involved here. This is a very, very, how to put it, realistic, so to speak, realistic geopolitical balance of power, realpolitik. We can use all those terms. Cynical, if we want to use that term. Bargain between Churchill and Stalin for a north-south division of East Central Europe, you might say. But of course it means you can't put up with Tito. Stalin can't put up with Tito making trouble because Stalin's got to be faithful to this agreement and it's got to yield control of Greece to the British. So that's the fundamental problem about Tito and Titoism, and that's the reason Tito has to be disciplined by the Soviet Union. They'd love to be able to give orders to Tito, but it's out of the question. And the way it's going to turn out is Tito is going to press the case by helping the Greeks to the point where the British are, violently combating the communist partisans in Greece and blaming the Soviets, and relations are getting worse and worse with the Soviets. And finally, Stalin is going to kick Yugoslavia out of the communist movement. And Yugoslavia is going to continue to be a communist country, of course, but it's not going to be part of the same movement, part of the same bloc, so to speak, the Soviet bloc, as the Soviet Union and the other East European regimes. So there you see it on the map, and Yugoslavia, as you see, enjoys now a different status, a kind of intermediate status, a pariah vis-a-vis the communist movement. Khrushchev will try to get him back, and we'll see some interesting variations on some of these themes we've been discussing. But this is the fundamental problem with Yugoslavia. Stalin kicked Tito out of the communist movement to please the West, the Anglo-Americans, as Stalin likes to put it, and mainly over the question of Greece. They can have Greece, and it's all because of this deal in 1944. So the British Empire then still counts for something. Still counts for something in Greece at any rate. And there it is from 1925. And this is pretty much what the British are trying to hang on to in the period that we're talking about. They're going through huge changes. As a matter of fact, there we have it shortly after VE Day and before the finish of the war, VJ Day, the victory over Japan. They hold an election in Britain, and Churchill was thrown out of power. Who led the country through all its great travail? The great hero, Churchill. The voters decided in the final analysis he'd done his job and time to retire him with thanks and to bring labor into power and to create a much more left Britain, a socialist Britain, really. And that's the language of the period. Labor talks in terms of socialist ideas. They're going to nationalize a lot of industries. They're going to try to nationalize credit and the railroads and all the rest of that. And a lot of it's going to be denationalized once they lose power in 1951. But at least for this point now, labor is going to be very left. And Stalin even says socialism is possible anywhere in the world, and it's even possible under the king in Britain. And this is what he's talking about. So labor is a very big deal. During the campaign, fighting against labor, Churchill accused them of being Nazis practically. Gestapo in Britain, says this headline from the Daily Express. If labor wins, it will be like the Nazis coming to power. They will dictate, etc. You know, kind of pretty low stuff, if you ask me. At the same time, as you can see from some of the other headlines here, the British are very much interested in what's going on in Asia. And I'll talk more about the British interest in absorbing, getting back their colonies, getting Hong Kong back, Singapore back, and establishing the French in Indochina and all the rest of that. We'll talk about that as we proceed. Here's Lowe's take on the matter, that the captains of industry they would like to see the British masses, disciplined as in the old days. But no, labor is going to impose something else. In fact, it's going to impose decolonization, at least to some degree. Well, maybe not. So the Conservatives out of power, and some of the labor people who are in power, including the foreign minister, Ernest Bevin, they take the view that the British Empire has to be held on to by hook or by crook, and it's certainly going to have to be by hook or by crook. So Britain has to hold on to empire. After all, it's living in a world that is run by the United States. They have to submit to the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, for example, and it's going to be a dollar that's going to be the main currency in the world. It's based on gold. In fact, it's a gold exchange standard in which the dollar is convertible into gold and nobody else is. So other currencies are going to be converted into the dollar. They'll be called hard currencies. The Russian ruble is not among them. But these hard currencies will be convertible into dollars. That'll be what gives them their hardness. But the dollar is going to be convertible into gold. What seems to go with that, if you've got a hard currency, you could call for gold if that currency is really attached to gold in any way, according to this gold exchange standard under which everybody's living. And that will become the big problem for us. So I'm just indicating a little signal of its appearance here at the end of the war. So Britain they got to live in this dollarized world. And what's involved with that, they have to borrow money from the United States under onerous conditions. The conditions are that they have to open up all of the British Commonwealth, open it up to American goods, open it up to trade, cannot keep it closed up the way it was in the 20s and the 30s. That's very tough for the British. They cannot compete with American products. So this is going to be very tough for them economically, but they figure it's imposed on the United States by virtue of its enormous power at the end of the war, which cannot even slightly be matched by the British. Moreover, the British are also trying to build nuclear weapons. So they've been cut out of support from the United States, at least access to information, from 1945 on. The McMahon Act cuts the British off from getting information about nuclear weapons from the United States. This is just at the point where they're starting to build the things. And so the British are going to have to do that all on their own, going to have to make a nuclear program all on their own. And in their very private discussions about this, you see them actually offering the rationale for nuclear weapons. Why do they need nuclear weapons? They're not saying primarily, they're eventually going to make this argument publicly in a big way that it's because they have to deter the Soviet Union. But privately, in these discussions during the days when they were deciding whether to do it or not, they put it slightly differently. They say we need these nuclear weapons in order to stand up to the United States. And what they mean is they have to have enough prestige to differ with the United States about colonial questions. So that's what that means. British are trying to hang on to India, trying to hang on to the Mideast and its oil. They get a lot of oil out of Iraq. Iraq is very much under their thumb, and will be until 1956. They get a lot of oil from Iran. They want to get that. Don't want to share that with the Soviets. Don't want to come to any kind of spheres of influence deals over the Mideast. They want the Soviets out of the Mideast. Hostility to the Soviets will be quite salutary for this purpose. So the attitude toward Mideast oil does not require a lot of interpretation. The French want to get back into Syria, a colony of theirs on which they have emotional claims that go back to the Crusades. But the British support the Arab League in Syria. To hell with the French, say the British. There's a big antagonism between the British and the French. De Gaulle, very, very sharp about this and very embittered about the British with regard to this, among a number of other questions, which we'll enumerate when we talk more about de Gaulle in the future. The Anglo-French antagonism over Syria bears on Israel, bears on Palestine, because the British are pretty much against the Jews setting themselves up as a state in Palestine. They want to turn over that Palestine mandate to a Palestinian government if possible. But the insurgent Jews won't permit it. They're going to be carrying out terror against the British there, and the British will be stuck. The Soviets will want to play in this game, and they want to play an anti-imperialistic game here, and they're going to be supporting the Zionists in Palestine in order to get them to fight against the British, to weaken the British Empire. And the French, since they've been opposed so bitterly by the British on Syria, in revenge are going to be sympathizing with the Jews in Palestine, the Zionists in Palestine, and are going to start to give them help with nuclear weapons as well. And this nuclear weapons help from France is going to be very important for the Israeli nuclear program at the end of the 50s and into the 60s. So it begins here. It begins over these questions. These are all kind of a temporary character because it'd be completely different in a couple of years. But because of the situation that we're talking about right at the end of the war, they have their quality. With regard to the Far East, the British don't want to see anybody unite China. They don't want to see the Kuomintang unite China. They certainly don't want to see the communists unite China. They want to get back Hong Kong. If China were weak, that would mean the British would have more influence. They've had zero influence since they're driven out by the Japanese, but now the Japanese are gone, and who knows what might be gained in China. But Chinese nationalism does not cut for the British Empire, so they have a difficult problem there to contend with. And moreover, they're carrying out counterinsurgencies right at the end of the war with with their own troops and with Indian troops, with thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of Indian troops that they're using in, for example, far-flung places all over the globe, and engaging with the communists in a struggle over Malaya. They're fighting over the northern part of Borneo. They're fighting in Nigeria and the Gold Coast, which will soon be called Ghana. So the multifaceted British military attempt at the end of the war to maintain their colonial influence, not all of which will be very successful. In fact, much of it won't be very successful. But at any rate, that's their mood. You might say that this wouldn't work if one had to be friendly to the Soviets. It almost entails Soviet enmity because you've got communists in all of these different places who are anti-colonial. So anti-communism, therefore, that's ABC really for the British. Not so much for the Americans, but much more for the British. Well, see, maybe for the Americans as well, because they have some elements in the United States that are very anti-communist and willing to take that. Excuse me, they're very, how to put it, rightist, and are very, in the American context, and willing to take that as far as they need to take it. I mean those who adhere to the idea of Jim Crow, mostly in the South of the United States. And here is an emblem of Jim Crow the minstrel himself. That means Jim Crow is what we usually use for the description of white supremacy in the American South vis-a-vis blacks who have been liberated from slavery, but who the whites do not want to liberate any further. We're referring, of course, to the Solid South in American politics as a democratic bastion and preserve, long-standing democratic bastion and preserve. So the New Deal really depends on all the votes of these Southern forces. There in the election of 1920, you see it very sharply. It involves the way that they keep power, the way that Jim Crow keeps power in the South by its secret police, by its Ku Klux Klan, by the institution of lynching, which plenty has done, and you will find out, of course, more about that if you haven't already from other courses that you will take, things that I don't go into a great deal of detail about, but lynching very prevalent throughout the 20s and the 30s, and even in this period, a lot of lynching and a lot of suppression of the vote in various ways. Poll tax, grandfather clause, white primary, various kinds of ways. They pretty much suppress the bulk of the black vote in the South. So the blacks would have a huge influence if they had real democracy, but they don't. They have Jim Crow. And of course, enormous discrimination that doesn't need to be described at length in this course. You may know all about it, or we'll find out all about it from other courses. We are interested, though, in this mood of white supremacy, this mood among the masses of people who should be Democratic voters, are Democratic voters in the South and supporters of the New Deal, but they don't want to put up with integration, don't want to put up with an end to Jim Crow, especially if it means an end to segregation and the full integration of their lives, social and otherwise, with black people. Hard for them to take it. We don't want to go to school with black people. We don't want to eat with them in restaurants, and you might put it even more strongly with Spanish or Mexicans either. Whites only, we don't feel safe at night with a lot of black people walking around in the street. Communists are active in trying to stick up for the black people in, of course, their own communist way. And they imagine the black people represent a national minority in the South. And there ought to be self-determination, quite a slogan. We're going to see this slogan with the Black Power movement in 1965, self-determination for the Black Belt as the area of densest black population, which you see indicated in the very dark black. Self-determination they advocate for the states, the Black Belt. And the civil rights movement will come around pretty much to this mood, black power. self-determination for black people in the United States by 1965, when we get to talking about the turn in SNCC to Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, about the Black Panther Party, and about related developments. But in the South, it's kind of interesting because it means support for anti-communism. It means a Cold War spirit. It means the identification of all the things they don't like, or maybe all the things they do like about Jim Crow, and an association of the people they're up against as communists. Race mixing is communism. It's a communist plot. And the people who stick up for black people in the segregated South, they're ultimately taking their orders from Moscow. It's this mythology about the influence of the Communist Party. There is, I guess, some influence of the Communist Party in the South, of course, but a mythology about how all of this ties up so intimately with the Cold War. It makes the proponents of Jim Crow, the last sentence in my paragraph there, the proponents of Jim Crow are avid Cold Warriors. Big, big factor in our story. And this course is going to have various ramifications. Here we have to take note of its origin, and we'll be talking more about it as we press on. Oh, sorry, going backward. Let's try going forward. Now, I stress the problem with the Democratic Party and the New Deal is that it requires the South to stay in power. It's hard to imagine Democrats ever getting elected if they don't have a solid South at this point. That's all going to change in our course and going to produce the world that we face today. But not so in the beginning. So a lot of these white supremacists, they're good New Dealers. Roosevelt can't do anything about them. Spiritually, he's not one of them, not in the slightest. Speaks against them in many ways, but he's got to play ball with them politically. That is, he cannot attack Jim Crow the way he would like and still stay in power. So the New Deal is in this dilemma. That's the problem. And you have to say that without the solid South, there probably would be no New Deal. It could never get power. It's the condition of American politics. Indicated here by a conference, especially we note the presence of John Rankin, a House representative from Mississippi, probably the spiritual voice and the most articulate figure, articulate in his own way. On the left of the screen, his right hand on the desk, to Roosevelt's right, John Rankin, ardent opponent of any non-whites, thought the internment of the Japanese was just great. Keep the Japanese in camps and keep them away from white people. He's against anybody who isn't white. He's not crazy about the Jews either. Refers to Walter Winchell, the columnist, the lousy kike. He likes to use that word, kike and nigger. Extraordinary language. Language of white supremacy, very frank about it too, very out front, and sometimes in Congress, in the House of Representatives, to use bizarre, horrible language like that. That's really the heart and soul of Jim Crow. And many who don't use that kind of language, who are Dixiecrats, probably do in private, when they have some kind of private session with people like Rankin. Probably do in private. And there are a number of others of them. In fact, we could give a whole course on the Dixiecrats and their influence in Congress and their power in American history, and and their roots in the slave power of the 19th century and all the rest of that. It's going to be very important for our story, but we cannot dwell on it to a very great degree here. Nevertheless, this is a fundamental source of communist, or I should say anti-communist sentiment. Now, let me put it in terms other than the strictly white supremacist. Let me put it in terms of economic factors as well. At the end of the war, the Southern Dixiecrats were afraid that the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, the big trade union, industrial trade union federation, was going to do a lot of organizing in the South and was going to have big, powerful unions of just about all the workers in the South, that they were going to try to do away with Jim Crow through legislation. I mean, you know, this is certainly real. The Democrats were, Northern Democrats, certainly talking about this. And they had to fight, felt they had to fight this no matter what. And they felt they had an ally in the Republican Party, the right wing of the Republican Party, that was still hostile, at least to some degree, to the New Deal. And they're led by a man named Robert Taft. Together they pressed upon the Congress the Taft-Hartley legislation of 1947 that creates right-to-work states in the South, gives Northern business a place to run when the unions organize it. They can run to a right-to-work state, and the unions will be pretty much suppressed in that state. So it establishes that, suppresses the political rights of trade unions in various ways, described by labor leaders as a slave labor law. So it's absolutely anathema to labor. But that was passed in 1947, still under a Democratic regime. So it gives you an idea of the power of the Dixiecrats, especially when they're combined with the right-wing Republicans. So that is what we're contending with. And they're all virulently anti-communist. And as a matter of fact, Cold Warrior perspectives, anti-communism, but Cold War perspectives in the largest geopolitical sense, give them a sort of a ideological weapon to use for these domestic aims. So that's something that's a vital, important thing, not a footnote in American history the way it is sometimes was treated, at any rate, in my time by historians who taught me. Not a footnote, a much more important factor. We can't touch on all the aspects of it right now, but we'll see it shaping up. The Truman Administration, as Democrats, have to contend with this thing, and so it's indicated by a Herblock cartoon, the Washington Post's liberal cartoonist, Herbert L. Herblock. He's talking about the coalition. The coalition he's talking about is the Dixiecrats, Southern Democrats, and the Republican Party, how they can stop all kinds of legislation. They can veto. They become a veto group, in effect, and stop all kinds of progressive legislation that the Democrats want to pass. So they represent a real problem for the Democrats. Into all of this, Churchill, out of power, still tried to intervene by coming to the United States in 1946 and making a speech which some people think is the beginning of the Cold War. Some historians call it a declaration of the Cold War. Walter Lefebvre, who I admire, he calls it a declaration of the Cold War. I can't endorse that idea. I don't think. Well, I go along with the idea that Churchill has made a declaration of the Cold War, but that Stalin has, I don't concur. Both these things happened in February of 1946. Winston Churchill's Fulton, Missouri speech is shown here with Truman on the dais, and Churchill gives a rousing speech, cites the Iron Curtain that has come across Europe, communist regimes behind it. Bear in mind, these are all party coalitions at the time the speech is given. They're not communist regimes in the full sense. At any rate, they're not instituting the dictatorship of the proletariat. They're not fighting for communism. But anyhow, Churchill says they're under tyranny. These are ancient societies. We've got to muscle up against the aggressions of Soviet communism. The only way we can do this is by the unity of the Anglo-Saxon peoples. He didn't say the unity of all the peoples on the globe, but mainly the Anglo-Saxon peoples. So that's the fundamental thing, and the U.S. and the British have to have the same foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. That is an overt call, Truman takes it very, very seriously, as you can practically see on this in this picture. Churchill asking for a union, a special relationship which already exists between the United States and Britain, and for a common policy on stopping the Soviets from their influence in northern Iran. Soviets want to attach the Azeri province of Iran to their Azerbaijan and broaden Azerbaijan thereby. Soviets already have most of the oil of the area, but they want to make these changes. And the Soviets also smile on Kurdish nationalism in northern Iran. So the Iranians, they're worried about those things as much as they are about the Soviets in Iran. Of course, naturally, they want to drive the Soviets out. And so the position of the Americans and the British, Churchill thinks ought to become one, and they will become one. Churchill warns the Russians warns that the Russians peril Christian civilization as we have known it. Churchill has a lot of friends in the United States. Here's Dean Acheson, Secretary of State, very tight with British officials, and there's a great deal of community of community of thinking about world politics between many of the leading officials in the United States and British officials, who are felt to know more about the world than the United States, to have much more experience dealing with strange places that the United States does not properly understand in the way that the British do. So there's a certain, tutelage that's taking shape here. Some have said, like the Romans and the Greeks, that the way the Romans looked to the Greeks for cultural leadership, inspiration, etc., that the United States looks to Britain in that way. And there are some other analogies that have been made about this relationship, but suffice to say that Churchill has enormous influence in the top levels of American government. So the argument is that Churchill in that speech was in effect declaring the Cold War, and so was Stalin, who made a similar speech in February of 1946. And that's not right. That's not right. The argument is that Stalin said that communism and socialism were incompatible. It's an inevitable that they'll war with one another. Wrong. That's wrong. That's a misrepresentation of reality. He never said that. An inevitability of a war between the Soviet Union and the United States? No. Between communism and capitalism? No. The inevitability of war? No. But he does say that we have to be on guard against what he calls sluchajnosti, accidents. Accidents. We have to have more 5-year plans. What won World War II, Stalin says? It was the Soviet 5-year plans that industrialized the country and armed it with the weapons that won the war. So he says that in the future there will have to be more 5-year plans. You can imagine how the Soviet public that wanted to see consumer goods, housing, things like that built, you can imagine how they felt hearing that news, bad news. Nevertheless, Stalin says the world is a dangerous place, but not because there's a Cold War on. That's not the argument there. The argument is that the imperialists always get to quarreling, and they'll have another war. And that's the experience we have had since 1917. Now, revisionist historians, people I've been referencing and quarreling with, commenting on, take note. Stalin is saying that the experience that the Soviets have had up to this time is that the imperialists cannot get along. In fact, they can't get along even to the point of opposing us. And he says this precisely. They are incapable. This turns out to be wrong. But he says they are incapable, these imperialists, of combining against communism, against the Soviet Union, because they have all these imperial interests that cause them to quarrel one with another, and those are more important. In fact, all our experience shows, from Lenin on, that those are more important than their quarrel, even with us, over fundamental ideological questions. This is wrong. So this says, in effect, we can't have a Cold War. The experience has been that the West always divides. That is true. They did divide in the 30s. And it is true that they sided with a portion of the capitalist world against another portion of the capitalist world. That's true. But the reading is that the imperialists are constitutionally incapable of combining and cooperating against communism. Incapable of Cold War. Wrong. Stalin is going to be proved wrong in spades on this. So it's just the opposite of the way it is commonly presented. But this announcement that the Soviet Union is going to have another 5-year plan, it kind of indicates that the Soviets are not going to allow the West to provide them with the wherewithal to rebuild their economy, at least insofar as it involves, making Western loans, integrating into Western financial schemes like the International Monetary Fund, or any of that stuff agreed at Bretton Woods. Soviets are not going to do that. They're going to maintain the right to still have 5-year plans and to prepare against sluchajnosti, accidents. To prepare against accidents. So it's a very cautious kind of speech. Been very much misrepresented by those who think Stalin is keen to have a Cold War. That makes no sense to me. Keen to have a Cold War. No. From the standpoint of communism, from the standpoint of Soviet national interest, from the standpoint of Russian national interest, no. Does not make sense to me. But when he did make the speech, he wasn't going to cooperate with other Western financial organizations. The Treasury Department, George Kennan tells us in his memoirs, the Treasury Department gave up all hope that they were going to reconcile with Soviet Russia at the end of the war. Harry Dexter White, the architect of the Bretton Woods system, wanted very much to be on good terms with the Soviets. And now even he and his boss, Morgenthau, they all have to give up on this. They're not going to be able to invest in Russia, supervise Russia, advise Russia, help Russia economically. Russia's going to retain the right to have 5-year plans and everything that goes with that. And Kennan says that at this moment, the Treasury Department, the last of the government agencies, he said, to hope for good relations with the Soviets, threw in the towel and asked him for an essay on the sources of Soviet behavior, which turned out to be his famous X article in 1947 for Foreign Affairs, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, it's called, and it lays out the expansion, the historical theory, kind of half-baked if you ask me, but a historical theory about the expansion of Russia across the landmass. It's like our geopolitical ideas of the world island. And he says they have to be contained, as Mackinder would have said, by a rim around it, a containment. So it's like the British containment, as we have already indicated. And that containment's going to be the line of the Cold War from this point on. There are going to be variations on it, strategies of containment, as John Lewis Gaddis likes to put it. But the containment will be the line, and that's how the containment idea finally was born. That is, the Cold War is going to look a lot like Mackinder's idea of the Rimland's relationship with the Heartland. And instead of cooperating with the Soviet Union over European questions, it's going to be a question of coming to the aid of Western Europe against communism, taking the offensive in Western Europe against communism. So remember, we've got communists in the parties of France and Italy, so they get kicked right out. Harry Truman announces the Truman Doctrine. Marshall announces a Marshall Plan. In expectation of getting Marshall Plan aid, communists are kicked out of the governments of France and Italy. The Soviets, angry about this, eager to retaliate some way, start kicking peasant party leaders. Iuliu Maniu in Romania, Mikołajczyk, Stanisław Mikołajczyk in Poland. Leaders like that, kicking them out of their coalition governments and making these governments into communist governments. So it's a consolidation of communist power. It's the death of Varga's whole line. Remember, Varga had a completely different conception of the balance between the all-party coalitions, East and West. And now they're all that's going by the board. We're going to have solidly Western anti-communist coalitions without communists, and we're going to have solid coalitions or solid regimes in the East dominated by communists. And pretty soon they'll be talking about agricultural collectivization and things like that. They'll be talking about all of the things that have to do with becoming more like the Soviet Union. But that's all because of the Cold War. And all the work of Harry Truman, pretty much. Stalin expels Tito from the Common Forum, sends aid to the Zionists to complete their project of closing in some areas in the north and south of Palestine. So here you see the areas involved. So in order to do all of this, in order to establish themselves there, they're going to have to carry out a very considerable expulsion of Palestinians, some 800,000 Palestinians say. And remember, they'll be doing this with Soviet weapons from the Skoda arms works in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia herself will be absorbed into the Soviet bloc. So the Cold War getting harder and harder and harder, especially in East Asia. Perhaps I should finish up talking about East Asia today. Talking about how at the end of the war, General Stilwell, commanding American forces in Burma, commanding Chinese Kuomintang forces in Burma for a fight against the Japanese, and Louis Mountbatten heading the Southeast Asia Command, how they came to rather different conclusions about what ought to be done at the end of the war. Stilwell, of course, wants to make the Kuomintang fight, has a very low opinion, despite what this picture seems to indicate, very low opinion of Chiang Kai-shek, calls him the peanut, and he mainly disdains him because he doesn't think Chiang Kai-shek is willing to fight, that's all. And Chiang Kai-shek is not going to fight according to American dictates. That's the whole problem. They're going to have a Chinese point of view about when to fight and who to fight. He wants to fight the communists more than he wants to fight the Japanese, but that's the main problem, whether you can get Chiang Kai-shek to fight. It's really a political problem more than a military one. Stilwell has a great reputation at home as being a sterling military figure. He certainly is. There's another military figure that's important politically, Claire Chennault, who has been, in effect, heading a Kuomintang Air Force since the 1930s, prior to the war. So this Air Force is an unofficial Air Force, and yet it portends, or at any rate, it acts as if it's a regular American Air Force, but it's under Kuomintang Command, Flying Tigers. There's some movies about the Flying Tigers and their Curtiss P-40Bs, the aircraft that they're flying, and some of their exploits in China, carrying out various kinds of missions. Chennault is a very keen supporter of Chiang Kai-shek against Stilwell, so there's an enmity between those two fellows. And Chennault will continue to be a supporter with Chiang Kai-shek. Followers of Chennault will develop the idea that Chiang Kai-shek was betrayed and that Stilwell is one of those who is responsible for it. It's a complicated question with very special Far Eastern characteristics that we maybe can't pursue the way we'd like at this point. Here's a picture of American representative, Republican, Patrick Hurley, sent by Roosevelt to try to effect some kind of a coalition between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist forces. And here they are, of all things, standing together to make some kind of a coalition government. It's never happened. Chiang Kai-shek never wanted to put up with it, always claimed, maybe correctly, that he could never live with the communists in a government. They'd always figure out a way to get rid of him. Maybe he's right about that. Who knows? That's a sort of a different question from what we're talking about. The policy of the Americans is not for Mao Zedong to take over China, but for Chiang Kai-shek somehow to win the day. Now, the first prong of this policy is a coalition, and they're going to try and force this. We've never seen this actually work, but in many ways, what Oliver Stone is talking about, an alternative to the Cold War, sometimes involves these coalitions, whether it's possible to compromise internally with communist regimes. Now, I always thought it probably is, but I admit, lots of difficulties with it. But anyway, that was the American policy, and Hurley was there to bring them together. And of course, they toasted each other. Can you imagine that? You know, the one on the right has been carrying out extermination campaigns to kill absolutely every communist possible. And this has been going on for almost a generation now. There they are toasting. So, such is realpolitik. And there's the situation in China at the end of the war with the Soviets pretty much having done all the fighting in Manchuria and having defeated the Japanese army. So they control all of northern Manchuria, including, for our purposes, very importantly, the town of Harbin at the top there, and with a little white dot, Harbin. They control that, and that's on the former Chinese Eastern Railway that runs from Chita to Vladivostok on the coast. So it runs right through the middle of Manchuria, and that's the route of supply for the Soviets to bring equipment into Manchuria, and also, you know, they can bring equipment into Korea that way too. Got various ways to bring equipment into Korea, and they're going to be controlling North Korea. But here they control Manchuria. And so this is pretty much the state of affairs in 1948. So you see, the communists have not won in a lot of areas in 48. The Kuomintang still has all the big cities. The United States has made sure to airlift enough troops in to support the Kuomintang forces. The Soviets have even been giving the Kuomintang weapons. The Soviets are on record for promoting a unity government between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. So they have the same policy, try to have the same policy as the Americans on this. But the whole Varga line for getting along with the Americans is not working in Europe at all. In fact, it's absolutely come a cropper, as the British would say, in Europe. So since it's going nowhere in Europe, and since Stalin is being treated so badly, he feels, in his efforts to try to accommodate the West, he's going to turn away from Europe and maybe throw his support into the East. So no sooner does the Varga line come under criticism in Varga, and there's a big public discussion in Russia denouncing Varga. He's all wet. So that means all the policy for cooperating with the United States is all wet. They're going to purge him and drive him right out of the government. They're not going to shoot him, but they're going to drive him out of the government. And they're going to change the line completely. So what's the opposite of the Varga line? The line for Cold War. The line for doing what Churchill and Truman are doing on the other side. They're fighting us in Greece. We'll fight them in Manchuria. And in the spring of 1947, for the very first time, Mao issued the slogan, "Down with Chiang Kai-shek." Down with Chiang Kai-shek. That's a big change in the line in China. Up to that time, it's cooperate with Chiang Kai-shek. Now, forget it. Civil war, all-out civil war. either or. It's going to be either the Kuomintang or the Chinese Communists. And the Soviets now are going to start supply the communist forces in China, who are very, very considerable politically, geographically, in every other way except in terms of military capability in big pitched battles involving tanks, tactical aircraft, lots of artillery, all that. They don't have all that gear. Soviets are going to give them all that stuff. Stalin's going to speak publicly, no, not publicly, excuse me, going to speak privately to the party. Tell them we're going to give all this equipment. More than that, we're going to send Soviet personnel to help Mao Zedong plan conventional campaigns and even establish a government. We're going all out for the Chinese Revolution. They didn't say this before 1947. But that's what's going to happen. So if you look closely at the dates on this map, you can see they all begin in 1948. So the Civil War has been going on since 46. Even while they were cooperating, Chiang Kai-shek's still trying to kill as many communists as he possibly can. He feels he's got to eradicate them. So one wonders if they ever could have cooperated. But that was the line. But as soon as that line changes, the Chinese communists are going to have all the equipment they need for big pitched battles and they're going to win them. And that's when you see the Kuomintang totally fall apart. The big Kuomintang armies recruited by Chiang Kai-shek as anti-communist fighters during the Long March. They're going to lose all these armies. They're going to go over to the communists. They'll end up fighting in Korea. We'll talk about that on another day. But there's the progression from big struggles in the north, down to the Yangtze Valley, down into the southern part of the country, and lastly, into Xinjiang and Tibet. And that's the new China, communist China of the Chinese Revolution, which will be completed in 1949. While this is going on, Stalin staged the Berlin Blockade. I'll allow you to read all about the blockade and think. She's pretty good with a lot of details about the blockade. Let me just say about the blockade that during this blockade, all the big battles were fought in China. It would be very easy to say that Stalin staged this blockade in order to capture the attention of the world and kick Tito out of the Cominform. All at the same time in the spring of 1948, kicked Tito out of the Cominform as a cover to provide events in the East to distract attention from the major military aid he was giving. Crucial, I call it crucial military aid, sine qua non, to the Chinese Revolution in the East. So that the Berlin Blockade becomes a kind of a cover, a weapon in the Chinese Revolution. Check the dates. Look at the dates and see if this hypothesis does not tempt further consideration. Well, the United States will solve the problem of the blockade not by military force, as some American officials advocated. Military, have war with Russia at this point. No. They fly in supplies to the Berlin. Great propaganda victory. Tremendous, great thing. And it's the Cold War, but it looks so nice. There's no real fighting. And there are great victories. So they defend. They're standing in Berlin despite everything. Looks very good. Except that during the thing, while the Chinese Revolution is going on, Soviets explode an atomic weapon. So they've done all this. Stalin has done all this without having nuclear weapons, just in the anticipation of having nuclear weapons. The United States has had nuclear weapons, has been able to attack the Soviet Union with these nuclear weapons. This is an enormous act of, how to put it, defiance by Stalin. But after all, he's the one who just defeated Hitler. So I guess if there's anybody on the globe who feels confident in carrying off an enormous political event, such as the Chinese Revolution, which has to be, in effect, a tumultuous event in the Cold War, the Berlin Blockade, I guess it would be Stalin. So the United States absolutely panicked and quite hysterical about nuclear weapons. We'll talk about the hysteria about it next time. But what they're facing in the world, and this is really the reason for the hysteria, a united Sino-Soviet bloc. Wow. Think about that in geopolitics. Get out your Mackinder, your Haushofer. What's it like when the world island has those two big powers right at the center of it in combination? Can the rest of the world oppose that amount of power? And there it is, the whole big story, and led by these two revolutionary figures, enormous tyrants in their own way. If you look at their internal regime, very unpleasant to their opponents, to put it mildly. But in their own terms, in terms of communism, in terms of the Cold War, I guess we have to start dropping all our old-fashioned, naive notions about the New Deal and the lovely coalition, about the progressive forces in the world, blah, blah, blah. Now we're talking about real revolution, Cold War, all-out struggle. These two have emerged as the great revolutionaries, enormous challenge to the West, a united Sino-Soviet bloc armed with nuclear weapons. So that's what we see at the end of our first chapter of the Cold War. Next time I'll talk about how that united bloc starts to try to take on militarily, in its own revolutionary way, the West, and attrit, especially the United States, and attrit the West. Send bodies home in coffins. See how long the West can tolerate that. See how long the United States can tolerate that in the Korean War. So we'll talk about those things next time. I'll leave you with this last thought, though. The right in the United States has always tried to make the argument that Chiang Kai-shek didn't get enough help trying to, put the kill on Mao Zedong in 1946 while the United States was thinking about a coalition between the two of them. That somehow we held him back, and Chiang could have totally wiped them out. I mean, he'd been trying to wipe them out for I don't know how long. Military, he couldn't do it. And that now, when they're going to get some help across the border from the Soviet Union, he's going to wipe them out. So that is an argument that a lot of right-wing writers, Chang and Holiday in their biography of Mao, they still try to peddle this argument that there was a great chance that Chiang Kai-shek could have completely destroyed the country. Nonsense, I think. I don't think there's anything to that. I can't imagine the Kuomintang wiping out the No, I can't imagine the Kuomintang wiping out the communists. But I can imagine the communists, with Soviet help, wiping out the Kuomintang. So then the right raised the question at the end of the whole thing, who lost China? Whose fault was this? Whose fault was the Chinese Revolution? And they like to give the answer, oh, it was U.S. fault because we held Chiang Kai-shek back. Maybe you could say it was the fault of Winston Churchill and Harry Truman for starting the Cold War with Stalin. Maybe they had a chance for Stalin to hold Mao Zedong back in China if they didn't kick the communists out of the French and Italian governments and do all those other things. They didn't defend Greece for the royalists the way they did. That's a question that comes up. I don't have really proper answers to all these questions, but they're fascinating questions for us, and I hope to get your opinion on them as we proceed.